You're a therapist, you want to save money, increase community, have more expertise around you, and gain more clinical experience by getting to know a diverse range of clients, interventions, and ways of being. So this video is for you. This video is about equipping you to be able to start your own peer supervision group or to be able to take part in peer supervision more fully. My name's Simon. I am a counsellor based in Oxford. I'm also a group facilitator for clients who have come out of rehab for addiction and are pursuing recovery. I've set up a couple of peer supervision groups over the years, as well as being part of both peer supervision groups as well as groups which provide supervision. I'm not a supervisor, and I want to say that with pride because I'd like to be able to equip you to safely set up and be involved in your own peer supervision groups without that sense of I'm not good enough, I don't know how to do this. If you're listening to this as a counsellor, a therapist, a coach, or someone else that does client work face-to-face with people, then my hope in watching is that you are in a place where you can set up your own group. If you're another member of my audience, maybe somebody who is not in this profession, then that's totally fine as well. And by all means, carry on listening to this. I guess maybe you might take from this that you can set up your own community groups in some way to gain some kind of therapeutic benefit from it. Feel free as well to listen to this entire talk. You can use it for your CPD requirements, or follow the timestamps and jump to a section that feels more relevant and helpful for you. My aim today is to encourage people to be able to set up and take part in their own peer supervision groups, to demystify what happens within peer supervision groups. And I'm going to start off a little bit slowly, assuming that we don't have that much knowledge, and just go over what supervision is and how groups can differ to one-to-one supervision. So super means above or beyond in the Latin, and vision means to be able to see. I remember the last time I got on a plane going on holiday, and you look at all your troubles, your issues, the things that you're concerned of, and then as you get further and further up in the air, they look smaller and smaller. And in many ways, that's what supervision is. It's going to somebody outside of us, someone beyond us, somebody who has different expertise and qualifications, someone who's probably a little bit further along the journey, to look at what's going on and to provide some different perspective. You may have heard it described as consultative support. I'm just going to outline some of the purposes for having supervision. The first and the most obvious one is with the client work itself. As counsellors, we hold complete confidentiality about the client work we do. I wouldn't even talk to my wife about individual things that my clients say to me. And that can lead us to be less objective. It can have risks on personal burnout if we are spending time with people talking about things that are very distressing in their lives. And it can lead to patterns of relating, transference, things bubbling up in our own personal history or touchstone. We do certain interventions that can work with some folks and not with other folks. Certain clients will have different presenting issues. They might have diagnoses of certain neurotypes or of mental health issues or particular histories. They might have different cultures they come from, different diversities in other ways. And in explaining this complexity, this history that happens with every person, just as every single relationship is unique and changes, every therapeutic relationship is unique, you might be getting a gist of why it's important that there is another human being that we can talk to get some objectivity around it. So the first part of supervision, and really the foundation, the reason why we have supervision as counsellors, is to reflect on our client work. The second reason for supervision is to ensure that we are acting ethically. In fact, we're meant to go through the ethical framework at least annually with our supervisor to ensure that there are no conflicts of interest, that we're serving the client's best interest, that it is fair for every client, that there's nothing nefarious in any way going on, like favoritism, and that we're remaining boundaried and objective in line with standards that our accrediting body, like the BACP, will set out to act in a way that is ethical. Third reason that we go through supervision is to inform our continual professional development, our CPD, to look at areas where we can advance, training we might want to do on techniques, on interventions, on theoretical ways of working, on particular presenting issues, on cultures, on backgrounds, things we need to inform ourselves on to develop, and the way that our CPD is lining up over the upcoming year. The fourth reason to have supervision is because of running your own business. And if you're not in private practice, then rather than it being around running your own business, it may be more about the structures of the organisation, placement or charity that you are part of. When we are training to be a counsellor, we learn how to respond to clients, we learn how to be self-aware, we learn how to do certain interventions, but at no point in my training was I taught how to do a tax return, was I taught how to set up a social media page, was I taught how to speak to my ideal client or work on my niche. These are all elements of running a private practice or of working as a counsellor that fall outside of the counselling relationship and what we're actually doing in the room, but are integral to being able to market and own a successful business. And so supervision can be a place to talk about those elements as well. And again, hopefully our supervisor is somebody who is a little bit further down the road or can offer insights and support on how to do those things, like the dreaded first tax return. I've worked in homelessness now for over 12 years, and a real sad reality is seeing the amount of burnout. And same in counselling. We are human beings. We're not these perfect divine creatures that have fully actualized and discovered ourselves. We're human beings, and we are just as vulnerable to setbacks and impacts in life that can influence how we are as counsellors. For example, let's imagine that there was a bereavement, even a little bereavement. Let's say my beloved cat died. I would be devastated, and I'll be carrying that into my client work. And so the next reason supervision can be helpful is in having a space to personally talk about what's going on in our life. And it's not counselling in that we wouldn't have a whole hour just talking about ourselves and what's going on for us. If there was a lot happening in our lives, we might be thinking about dipping our toes back into having personal therapy. A lot of the outcomes of therapy are based on the therapeutic relationship, and a lot of that comes from our ability to be with clients in the void and the difficult things that are going on in their lives. And so a real integral part of supervision is on looking out for our self-care, on talking around the things that are troubling us in our lives, and ensuring that we have support and ways of decompressing outside of just our therapy lives. And counselling can also be quite a lonely profession. You know, much of my day is spent sat on this messy desk talking away to people on Zoom, or to going to a little room I rent out and seeing people. And that can be a little bit isolating. I mean, I'm not lonely, I'm not saying that, but it can be isolating, and many therapists will say the same thing. So being able to link up with other people and talk about your work can ease some of that isolation and boost connection, which is something I thoroughly believe in. And it's another reason I'm doing this on peer supervision or personal development groups, those kind of things where you can boost your connection with other professionals who have similar work to you. And then the final reason I'm going to talk about, the final benefit of supervision, is in relationship. You start to get to know your supervisor in a real personal way. They get to understand your way of working. They get to impressions of how you are as a person. You start to feel safe, and safety is the most pivotal thing in counselling. It's why confidentiality is such a big part. And the same with supervision. You need to feel safe with your supervisor to talk about things that are unpleasant, like when we've made a mistake, or if we're experiencing erotic transference towards a client, or if we feel shame or frustration, or we're struggling working with someone. We need to be able to voice those kind of things, the inner stuff that is scary to say out loud. We need to be able to voice that with a trusted person like a supervisor, because if we don't voice our shadow side, then it just lingers away. It sits up there. We can't just repress our dark thoughts or our ways of being that are unprofessional or don't feel therapeutic. They'll be up there anyway. So we need a supervisor we feel safe with to voice that, and a supervisor that we start to build a relationship with, that will see us over the months as things change, as we change, and one that we can talk about what's going on between us in this moment. My personal supervisor is a bloody wonderful guy, person-centered counsellor, Mike Clement, who offers a real relational approach to counselling. And there's something powerful about the sense of encounter that can happen between me and Mike, that can give me insights in my client work which go beyond if he'd just kind of given me some advice or suggested I read through this good practice in action guideline or read this book. There's something about therapeutic encounter within a supervisory relationship that can transform us to be able to be the person our clients need us to be. So the final purpose I'm going to say around supervision is in having a counsellor you can really be with, and you can use that relationship to better your therapeutic relationships. There can be risks and safeguarding concerns in client work and as being a counsellor. Some of them may be public liability risks. If a client is trying to take you to court for misconduct, it could be a liability risk around a client tripping over when they're walking over your threshold into your house. But there can also be risk and safeguarding concerns that say a client discloses terrorism, that they are making plans to end their life, or talking about suicidal ideation. Maybe you have concerns around a child, or they disclose a crime which they have committed or intend on committing. What do you do with that information? Having an individual supervisor rather than a group supervisor can be really important in having a contact that you can speak to out of hours to ask questions around safeguarding concerns, around things that have impacted on you personally. Sometimes there can be something really transferential that you might hold after a session, and it can be useful to have a point of contact that you can speak to in an emergency or before you're about to make some kind of decision that can have ethical or legal consequences. So another point of supervision that I want to mention as a disclaimer is the emergency contact for those considerations like welfare concerns for clients. I'm saying this before I move on to the next section to talk about types of supervision, individual, group, or peer, to really emphasize that going down this route that I'm trying to encourage you on peer supervision, doesn't mean that you will be replacing your individual supervision. Do still have a supervisor. You benefit from having an individual that you can speak around all those other aspects like your business besides the clinical stuff. It's an emergency contact if you have these real concerns. And you also need an individual supervisor if you're going through processes like accreditation to do paperwork, etc. outside and advocate for you. My hope so far is that I have made you excited about the prospect of supervision, that you've seen it reaches many needs beyond just the clinical stuff, although that is the integral core of it, and rather than seeing supervision as some task or obligation that you're forced to do and costs you an awful lot of money, which it does, it's something that you will actually look forward to and be able to use as part of your counselling journey. Counselling isn't a regulated profession. Joe Bloggs off the street could open up a little sign above their door and advertise in the local newsagent saying, "I am a counsellor and I offer counselling." And legally there'd be nothing stopping that person from calling themselves a counsellor and having that protected title. There are, however, a number of accrediting bodies in Britain which dictate expectations of ethical practice. They're the same bodies that ensure that we've had sufficient training for every counsellor who's part of those bodies. They all have had a minimum of 4 years part-time training, and ensure that we act professionally, ethically, and that we continue to work on ourselves doing things like 30 hours of continual professional development a year. There are lots of different awarding accrediting bodies, such as the NCPS, but I'm going to talk about the BACP, the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, who I am a member of, and their acronym BACP doesn't sound quite so good back if you say it out. But I'm going to talk about the BACP requirements for supervision. Some countries, like the US, require people to have supervision just when they are in training, and once they become a qualified counsellor, that requirement for supervision stops. Britain, we're different. We expect people to be having supervision regularly throughout their career, at least monthly for 90 minutes. That's the minimal requirement for the BACP. And if you are an actual qualified counsellor, if you are registered or accredited or an individual member of the BACP, that can be a mixture between individual supervision, between group supervision, and between peer supervision. And you have to have that 1.5 hours, and then it may be that you choose to have more supervision depending on your clinical needs or what's going on with you in your life. If you're training as a counsellor, the trainee requirements are a little bit different. So you have to have a minimum of 1.5 hours, but then there are some more stringent conditions, like you must have supervision at least once every 2 weeks, and supervision must be with a qualified professional supervisor to lead it. So when you're training, you can't have peer supervision. You could do, but you won't be able to count it towards those hours you need to document and log as part of BACP membership. You're also, as a trainee, expected to have an additional hour of supervision for every 8 hours of client work you do. And there are 4.3 weeks in a month. So if you were seeing 3 clients a week, 3 times 4 is around about 12. So you'll be looking at having an additional hour on top of 1.5 hours that you require. For individual supervision, you can count every single minute of supervision towards your requirements. If you're having group supervision, whether that be that you are a qualified counsellor and it's a peer group, or this is a group of supervisees led by one supervisor, you need to divide the amount of time by the number of other supervisees in that group. So if a group has between 2 and 4 people, you divide the amount of time by 2. So if you had 2 hours of peer supervision or group supervision, you would be able to count 1 hour towards your 90-minute requirement of supervision a month. If a group has more than 4 people, so let's say a group had 10 people, you'll divide that time in the group by the number of people in the group. So that same 2-hour group, we'll be able to count 12 minutes towards our monthly requirements. For that reason, if counsellors are using group supervision to bulk up the expectations of how much supervision they have in a month, group supervision is capped at 4 people. Having anything more than 4 people will significantly reduce the amount of time that you can claim. Even that 2-hour group in a group of 5 would reduce the amount of time you could take from 60 minutes down to just 24. So when you look at group supervision, you're generally talking groups of 4 or less. So let's go back to terms one more time. And I've mentioned 3 different types of supervision. The first is individual supervision. That's where I'm hanging out with Mike Clement and we are talking one-to-one about my client work, my business, all those other elements. And that's just me and him, that's supervision. The second is group supervision. So that would be where you have a qualified counsellor who is supervising a group of other counsellors. When I was doing my placement, a clinical psychologist was supervising me and 3 other supervisees. So we would often be talking about our client work. We'd have a time slot. We'd talk about our client work. The other supervisees might respond, but most of the talk is happening between the supervisor and the supervisees. We're just having 4 people being supervised at once. And then the third type of supervision, which is what this video is about, and I apologise that we're 20 minutes in and I've only just got to it. The third type of supervision is peer supervision. And that's where you have up to 4 counsellors. No person is in charge of it. All of us are equal. And we will divide the time and the supervisory session up so that we're all meeting our own needs and clinical requirements. So this is what I'm talking about when I say peer supervision. I'm talking about supervision that isn't led, maybe facilitated, and I will talk a bit more later about facilitation, but it's not led by any single supervisor. And the other benefit of this type of supervision compared to group supervision is you're not paying for anyone's time. It may be that you're looking to do it face-to-face, in which case you might have room hire fees, and it may be that one person is doing a lot of legwork in the facilitation and is deriving some kind of income from it. But generally, peer supervision is free. All of the supervisees are entering into it of their own free will. They're all spending time together to boost their experience and their supervision requirements, and no one is paying for it. And that's part of the allure of it, part of a reason I'm trying to advertise and encourage you to set up your own groups, because being a counsellor is quite a competitive trade. It can be difficult to make a living. The BACP estimates that most of us earn less than 10 grand and do this job part-time as well as other work, and reducing costs, increasing our communication, our exposure to other therapists, and it really helps to boost our exposure to different ways of working, different presenting issues, etc. But yes, a major reason why people look at peer supervision is because it saves money. So the rest of this video is going to be more focused on peer supervision, like it actually says in the title. Thank you for bearing with me. And it might be a bit pithy as I come up with different things relevant to it. But I hope from this that you can feel more encouraged to set one up and better able to facilitate it and gain from supervision in a peer group. First up, let's talk about different ways of doing therapy, the modality or philosophy of therapy. The BACP list a number of different approaches to therapy, and if you go through this guideline you will find actually 35 different approaches to therapy, all of them having their own ideas around how therapy is done and how we should or should not practice. And this can be confusing when you're going to peer supervision, and you may well be matched up with therapists that are different modalities to you. And then if we complicate things even further by looking at the client group, the age, the diversity impacts of different clients you see, then you will notice that there are millions of different ways of working, depending on who you're working with and how you work. So if I went in to try and search for a peer supervision group that worked in a person-centered way with neurodivergent clients, then I imagine that's quite a niche. And I'm sure if I searched on the person-centered association that it does exist and I could find working groups that match those needs. But there's a degree of compromise in trying to find people who align closely with your way of working and the clients you work with. The 35 different approaches I mentioned earlier can be quite overwhelming. So you might find it easier to just break things down into subsets of types of therapy. The common ones are looking at things from a more psychodynamic approach, so looking much more at the unconscious, looking much more deterministically on the impacts of childhood, working in a more kind of clinical way with people, of CBT approaches, which are much more based around interventions and homework, working much more with the present moment and giving clients things to do to change their thinking patterns. And then maybe more relational approaches to counselling, which are much more trusting in the client's ability to move themselves towards positions where they can to advance. But there are lots of different approaches to therapy, and I guess what I'm trying to say to you is don't get too bogged down on trying to find other practitioners that practice in exactly the same way as you. I mean, even if there were two person-centered counsellors working in neurodivergence, like I described myself, I would imagine that the two of us would work in slightly different ways because we are different people working with different clients. And it's actually one of the benefits of doing peer supervision, that you'll be exposed to ways of working that are different to your own, of techniques and interventions that are different to how you practice, and of client groups outside of the normal client groups you work with. I, for example, don't work that much with trauma, but a lot of my peer groups are very focused on trauma work. And that can be really enriching to be able to work with some wonderful peers who are navigating trauma with clients and vicariously learning about that and be able to offer my own insights. It enriches us both. So try and find people who work from a modality that has resonance and similarities to yourself. And if there are differences, then bring it to your own supervision. Have that as your real sounding block. When I was training as a more relational counsellor, the clinical psychologist I mentioned was bloody brilliant. I really enjoyed working with her. But she did some talking, some education work around borderline personality disorder that was very different to the way that I was training, the way of conceptualizing it in person-centered. We talk about things like fragile process, for example, and it just left me a bit confused and feeling as though I was being pulled in several different directions. So that's a risk from working with peers who are a different modality to you. But I'd also say that I gained a hell of a lot from working with somebody who worked differently to me. You might have seen the video I did on grounding techniques. So things like drinking a cool glass of water to cool us down and distract us when we are outside our window of tolerance. Those aren't person-centered terms, but it's stuff I've become exposed to by working with someone who's different to me. And it's stuff that, yeah, I blend into my practice every now and then. So it can push us out our comfort zone. But I guess in summary, what I'm trying to say is work with other therapists who you can match with and there are similarities. But don't be afraid if you are a Gestalt therapist and you're working with a transactional analysis therapist, or if you are a person-centered therapist and there's somebody who's an emotion-focused therapist in your group. You're a Freudian and you're stuck with a Jungian. Like, try and look beyond just the content and way of working. There are a lot more gains than just that. My next point is on how do you find other people to be in a peer supervision group with? I've recently been doing some work with an Oxford startup called Aligned Therapy, who are really wonderful. They've got this brilliant philosophy about trying to run therapy platforms from a counsellor's perspective. But we're doing a piece of work, Liam and I, at the moment, around setting up peer supervision groups. And we have 25 people on the team, and 10 of them are interested in peer supervision. So I guess with that little case study, as small as it is, what I'm trying to say is that it's actually a real need. It's not something that is only a couple of people who are thinking, oh, I might join a peer supervision group. It's very valuable. A lot of people would like it. So I wouldn't be too afraid about asking to setting up a peer group. And if it's a peer group with 2 people or 4 people, it doesn't really matter. That can still be quite potent. You can still gain a lot from it, and you can still use those hours. So if you can only find one other person to set up a group with, then that's really valid. So I've sometimes set up peer groups with organisations or referral agencies I've been a part of. I mentioned Aligned. I've set one up with Hope Therapy and Counselling Services. The Listening Centre used to run their own group supervision, and I set up a peer group to focus on opening a private practice afterwards. It might be that you're part of social media. As a millennial, I am fairly active on Facebook, and I've not dipped my toes into the newer platforms. I opened TikTok last week. But there are, on Facebook, for example, there are a lot of groups set up which are there to support counsellors, things like counselling staff room, counselling tutor, new therapists in private practice, counsellors in private practice. If you just Google counselling groups on Facebook, you'll be amazed by the amount of groups they are. And sometimes those groups will have specialist posts that come up talking about setting up peer groups. Other times you might be able to just post in them, and the group will have rules around what is and what isn't okay. It might be that you're feeling quite brave, and it might be that you actually want to go on to somewhere like a counselling directory and look at therapists in your area who have similar ways of working. Maybe they also are person-centered people working in Oxford in neurodivergence, and you want to post them an email and be like, you know what, you seem like someone I'd like to get to know more. How about we meet up once a month and have a peer group? And that can be a really good way of networking and building your exposure. Another really good tip if you're trying to build a peer group is to contact people who you trained with, because you know that they would have undergone a similar modality in their training, and you will also have had some kind of connection with them already. Or it might be that you just want to put a comment in this video, or comment in other groups, or put something out there. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it sounds a bit daunting setting up a group, but one, there is a lot of desire for it, so it's not that threatening. And 2, however you do it, you're probably doing a good thing for you and other people. So cross that boat, be brave, see if you can set one up. When I work with clients, I have a contract and a data processing agreement. I have 5 fun pages that undergo all of the boundaries, the expectations, the time, emergency contact, lots of different elements. And you probably have a contract for your personal supervisor, which talks about things like when you meet, how much you pay, what the expectations, what the purpose are of the supervision that you have with them. Is there a out of contact procedure, a safeguarding concern procedure, how they handle your data, all those kind of things. When I've set up peer groups myself, it's tended to be a little bit more informal. I don't think I've ever actually set up a peer contract. It's probably quite a wise idea to cover you for legal things and to help people to have an idea of the boundaries, but it's something to think about, particularly if you're already a supervisor or if you are a supervisee and have a contract from your supervisor. Just thinking about, are there any contractual requirements or expectations that we want to make explicit before the role of peer supervision begins? And because there's no leader in a peer group, it's more of a facilitation process, it can feel a little bit more informal sometimes. Maybe there can be a bit more of a desire to keep people on track than if you were doing one-to-one supervision work, let's say. So it might be that drawing up a contract formalises things in a little bit more detail than would happen if you just stroll into it. And I guess I leave it up to you. There's no requirement to have a contract, but I leave it up to you to think, should I have a contract? And if so, what kind of things should we include in it? You know, do we set out the time and date that we're going to meet each time, the venue? Is there any cost to it, for example, for room hire? How do we handle confidentiality? Is there a time when that confidentiality might ever be broached? What do we do about notes that we might write on reflection afterwards? Do we formalise what happens to those notes? What happens if we're meeting remotely through Zoom and then the internet dies out? Or how long do we wait if somebody doesn't turn up? Do we have a WhatsApp group that we contact one another in outside of it, and what is and what isn't okay to message in those groups? So all I'm trying to say is have a think about whether or not you need a contract. And from personal experience, I never have, but it might be a helpful thing. There are lots of different philosophies around how you do supervision, what the process itself looks like. And so I can't really be descriptive and tell you this is how a peer group should look. I think that would sound quite arrogant. But maybe I can share my personal reflections on what I particularly enjoy from a peer group. And that's partly because of my things like my attention span. It's partly because of my bladder, because I drink a lot of water. And it helps me to reflect and move between. And I find for myself, having boundaries in place, like knowing time limits, really helps me to settle and to know that I'm going to get a turn and we're not going to run out. So personally, in peer supervision groups, I really like having around 37.5 minutes per person. So if we're in a peer group of 2 people, then I would go for about an hour. If we were having a peer group of, an hour and 15. If we were having a peer group of 3, I would probably want a little bit longer. If we were having a peer group of 4, I'd probably want about 2.5 hours or so. And the structure I like to have is beginning with a check-in. So that's very much, how are we in this moment, here and now? And that's important because once we check in with our experience, we're already being more congruent. We're opening ourselves up to the process of therapy and opening ourselves up to what might be going on with other people. We might be tired or bored or stressed or just not feeling it on that day, or we might be really excited and longing to start supervision. So I love that starting bit around the check-in. Then I tend to suggest people have around about half an hour or so each for a client. After the second person, I suggest having a break to have a quick wee and get rid of that water, or to top up on another coffee. I've had 3 of them since I've been filming this, I'm sad to say. And then another 2 people. And after the 4th person has done, we again have a checkout to say how we're feeling in this moment, which helps us to debrief and to move on to the rest of the day. Now, that might be a bit hardcore. Thought of a 2.5 hour group is a sizable amount of time to take out of a morning once a month. And there's no correct amount of time that you need to have. It may be, for example, that you say you're going to have a 2-hour group, people check in, you look at how much time's left and divide it back up, so you end up having like 20 minutes a person instead. Or it might be that you're a little bit less anal than me and that you don't try and stick to that time limit. And I would say, this is a general tip, that with things like timekeeping, use it as a rough guide, try and stick to it. It ensures everyone has a chance to speak, but it's not about being rigid. For me, group process, particularly if I'm leading a general group, like a recovery group, like groups are all about responding to what's happening in the moment and being willing to adapt a little bit. But I think there can be a benefit from having a framework. So that's what works for me. A little bit of time to check in at the beginning, chance to have a wee halfway through, time to check out at the end, and then a set amount of time per person to have your supervision. For the period itself, for your allocated time, if you divide it up as I've suggested, each modality, each philosophy of supervision will embody supervision in their own unique way. But generally, I suggest that you just bring one client. It's not an awful amount of time. We're talking somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes a person. So it's not a great deal of time to be able to explore several different clients. It might be that you are instead exploring a theme. Let's say, for example, you have a number of clients who are talking about themes of death anxiety and that's resonating with you. It might be that you choose to focus on one particular theme, but my general suggestion for peer groups is that rather than bouncing, that you try and keep it fairly focused on just having one client that you bring to peer supervision that month. And I often find that peers will start off by talking about the client. It will be more based on narrative, so describing who they are, talking a bit about what they've come to counselling for, a description of the process they're going through. They might talk about some of the interventions they've done, or they might talk about how they perceive that client or what comes up for them. And then once that person has said what it seems like they need to say about the process of that client, then leaves a space for other people to say what's coming up for them. One of the really powerful things that I enjoy, and this might be my way of being a counsellor, or it might be something about group process, is something called parallel process. So quite often when we bring a client to groups, we might start acting out that client's process. So let's say, for example, that client is incredibly anxious and likes to, that's very judgmental, incredibly anxious and externalizes some of their problems. It might be that we enter into group and we feel quite timid and we're asking for a lot of advice. Please can you help me with this client? I don't know what I'm doing. I feel so de-skilled. I've tried doing this and this and this. It doesn't work. And there's a sense of almost acting that out within the group process. So there can be something quite powerful about noticing what's going on for you when somebody else brings their client, and also noticing what's going on for the supervisee as they bring that client. As you start getting to know them as well, you'll notice changes in their process. So it might be they're normally quite a confident counsellor, but they brought this person, this fictitious person we just spoke about, and they suddenly feel quite timid, almost make themselves small. So being able to notice those things and respond congruently can be quite potent. It might also be that you are educating, that you're talking about a particular client group that they haven't worked with before. So let's say, again, the same fictitious anxious client, you might be talking about how generalized anxiety disorder or about external loci of evaluation. You might be trying to conceptualize it with your understanding of that presenting issue. It may be that you are talking about an intervention that you have done. Maybe you do some mindfulness at the start of a session with somebody, and that calms them down and stops that need to fill the silence that you have found really helpful, and you think that might be helpful for my peer. So this is much what that half an hour is about. The supervisee brings their client both in the narrative, but they will also start acting it out usually. And then the other supervisees respond with their experience, with their suggestion, gives chance to go deeper. And once we start getting towards time, say we've got 30 minutes, you've got 5 minutes left, we start to kind of think, does that feel like it's met your need? Is there anything that you'd like to say in response? Any summary you'd like to have? And that's sort of a process of group supervision, in my experience, of what we go through when we are bringing one individual client or a very focused presenting issue. The first session that you have may be a little bit different to future peer supervision sessions. I strongly encourage the first check-in that you have with a new group member to be much longer, even if that takes away some of the client processing time, so that you can get to begin to know one another's strengths and areas of specialisms. You may want to say things like your name, how you are in this moment, what you enjoy doing as hobbies, but clinically it can be useful to say how long you've been in practice, what kind of counsellor you are, your modality, the people group that you work with, maybe any interventions you do, but checking in a way that helps your peers to understand who you are, what you know about, what your interests are, what your expertise are. And that can be helpful in any group, if it's a peer group or if it's a personal development group. Personal development groups, as a side point, are more like a group that chat and connect and bond, like an encounter group. This can be helpful as well with referrals. So let's say, for example, I have a client who's come to me who's really looking for support with eating disorders. I might do a little bit of support around sensory profiling and being interested in their experience of eating, etc. But it might be that it comes to a point when I think I would love to refer you to somebody who really knows about this, that can hold you and support you. And I've got to know some peers who are bloody good at that. And that's kind of what peer supervision can do. In the same way that I talked about not working so much with trauma. I'm not going to turn away a client who has experienced trauma, because most clients have. But if that's a specialism, then I can think of specialists who really work in that area. So part of that first session is around checking in with what your experiences are and how you work, so that you can bond a little bit more as a group. Another first group meeting that I would encourage, if it's going to be a long-term group, is generally thinking about what are the group norms and boundaries and expectations that you would like to have. How do we divide the time? What do we do if someone is late? What's the purpose of a group? How do we use supervision? How do we respond? Do we talk over people? Do people not like being interrupted or challenged? Like, how do we work in the most efficient way for every person? And that's a useful conversation to have with the group members, rather than just coming in with my prescriptive, we're going to have 37.5 minutes per person, and this is how it's going to go. If we're too prescriptive, people resist and groups don't tend to flow. We've got to go with the group, and setting out the group norms and boundaries are part of that process. This talk is already approaching the 1 hour mark, and so I don't really have time to talk about the stages of group development like I am showing you on this computer screen. But if you contact me, then I will send you these 2 pages talking about Tuckman and Jensen's 1977 stages of group development. But I wanted to briefly mention it because it segues quite nicely into facilitation. When a group is first formed, it hasn't yet come together as an efficient whole. Just as people change and are one entity, a group is one being as well as being made of separate individuals. I know that sounds a bit new age, but it's true. Groups actually develop and grow. They start to realize norms. They start to bonds, they start to respond in effective ways together, which often involves travelling through conflict and navigating differences. As I say, this could be a whole video just talking about the stages of group development and Yalom's different purposes of groups, etc. But I wanted to talk about group development for a very simple reason, and that's to say that when a group is first formed, they very much look on one individual to facilitate it. So rather than talking amongst each other, quite often group members will enter in feeling a little bit nervous, a bit unsafe, and looking to have somebody to kind of facilitate it. Looking to have somebody who maybe talks a little bit more or answers more questions or guides the process. And I want to talk about the purpose of having a facilitator. Peer groups, there is no inequality. It's not that one person is better than the others or more qualified or the supervisor. They're not. But you tend to need someone to facilitate it. And the facilitator's role is mostly administrative. So somebody who is going to send out the Zoom link, or to say at the end, shall we meet at this time next week, or to remind people about the appointments. Especially in the early sessions as well, it's somebody that can be a bit more outspoken around the timekeeping to ensure that everybody has chance to check in. They're not draconian or trying to force the process, but a group member is just there to facilitate the process and to ensure that everybody has chance to gain the most they can from peer supervision. And I'd almost encourage, in much the same way that I talked about the initial session, I would almost encourage people to agree on things like time limits. Even at the beginning, shall we have X amount of time a person, so that it feels less of a burden on the person trying to facilitate, to try and force a group to contain to a particular structure. At the end of the day, we all want to do this willingly. We're all peers trying to learn from one another. And all the facilitator is doing is trying to make sure that everybody has a chance to gain what they need to from supervision. This video went on a lot longer than the 20 minutes I expected it to. My hope that you've taken from this is that individual supervision is vital and you need to keep seeing your supervisor. But there are tremendous things that you can gain from being part of a peer group for supervision, such as reducing the fee you have to pay, increasing the perspective, and getting a little bit of community and support that can be difficult in this trade as a counsellor. Even though this video has been quite long, my hope is that you'll go away with it thinking that actually it's not as complicated as it sounds to set up a peer group, and that you might even be encouraged to either set up your own or to consider setting one up. Please feel free to put any questions in the comments. A fairly small channel, so I tend to read and respond to every single one of you, and I would be delighted to read them. And be brave, like literally just reach out, see if you can set one up. I would be really delighted to hear about how you're finding the process of doing peer supervision. I also disclosed at the beginning that I am not a supervisor, so there may well be things that I've missed. I've set up and been part of various supervision groups as well as group facilitation, but I don't claim to be an expert, and I think that makes this video even better, because if I'm an expert it can feel inaccessible, but there are inevitably things that I have missed, so I would love to read if you comment on your thoughts or extra things that we should consider, particularly as this month I've been thinking about how can we formalise more the process of supporting people to set up and run peer supervision groups. My name's Simon, as I said at the beginning. I am a person-centred counsellor based in Oxford. I also work online through Zoom, WhatsApp. I've seen people on Discord now, or Teams, or all sorts of online stuff. I also offer home visits if you live fairly close by. I'm a person-centred counsellor. I offer a relational approach to counselling, and I am particularly interested in neurodivergence, autism in particular, but ADHD as well. I work a lot in addiction, bereavement, and I really love geek culture. So if you're a fellow geek, I would love to spend more time with you. Feel free to contact me if you are interested in counselling, or check out some of the other videos on sometimes weird and wacky stuff, like can we use hot cross buns and traffic lights in order to regulate ourselves, or is there benefits from crafting or playing video games, and sometimes more theoretical, like theories around grief. Mostly though, what I do is make shorts, lots of little shorts and little reflections on life, and you can catch pretty much all of them over here by looking at my shorts. Sounds dodgy. You can also find me on Facebook at Simon's Listening Counselling Services, and like I said last week, I set myself up on TikTok at Simon's Listening. Thank you for you listening, and like I say, I genuinely wish you the best. I hope that you can build community and that you can find some bloody good people to connect in with. Thanks again.